You won't believe what happened when my HOA thought they could park illegally in my warehouse and how I took control back. Welcome to Tales Kingdom. Before we dive in, please hit that like button and subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories just like this one. Now, let's get started. It all started when the local homeowners association, HOA, started granting permission for its members to park in my private warehouse space, which I had been renting out for my personal business needs. At first, it seemed like a harmless request, given that I had a large space, and I thought maybe it would be a temporary solution for the neighbors. But soon enough, the situation spiraled out of control. Members of the HOA, some of whom I barely knew, began showing up to park their cars and trucks, sometimes without even asking for permission. Initially, it was only a few people, but over time, more and more residents started taking advantage of my warehouse. It wasn't just occasional parking anymore. People were leaving their vehicles for days on end, sometimes weeks. I had not been properly informed or asked whether I was okay with this, and the HOA board seemed oblivious to the growing problem. To make matters worse, some of the cars were left in ways that obstructed my own access to the warehouse or the things I needed to get done. They blocked the loading docks, and once even a fire lane was covered by a car from the HOA. I reached out to the board, explaining that this was becoming an issue, but the HOA members simply waved it off, saying it was a minor inconvenience. However, what really angered me was that they never formally addressed the situation with me. The attitude was one of entitlement. Some HOA members started acting as if my warehouse was their personal parking lot. I also discovered that some were allowing their friends and extended family to park there too, adding to the chaos. The situation had become overwhelming, and I began losing control of what was meant to be my private space. I even found myself having to work around parked vehicles, which made the business aspect of my warehouse nearly impossible to manage. Frustrated and desperate, I started documenting the situation. Every time a car was parked without permission, I took pictures, keeping track of the date, time, and the vehicle's license plate. I started taking notes and recording every incident because I knew I would eventually need proof. The tension between me and the HOA grew, but no one seemed willing to help or step in to resolve it. I felt helpless. The stress was eating away at me, and I couldn't focus on my business or feel secure in my own property anymore. I knew something had to be done before this situation spiraled further, but I wasn't sure where to turn. Would the HOA eventually act, or would I have to take matters into my own hands? After exhausting all options and receiving no response from the HOA, I realized I had to take drastic action. I was at a breaking point. My business and personal space were being overrun, and I couldn't let this continue. I began researching my legal rights. I found out that, as the owner of the warehouse space, I had the authority to remove vehicles that were parked without my consent, even though the HOA members had treated the area as if it was their own private parking lot. The more I researched, the more I realized that I had every right to protect my property. With a plan in mind, I hired a local towing company and got the legal backing I needed to start removing the cars. The first vehicle towed was a real turning point. It belonged to a member of the HOA board. When I saw that tow truck pull up and drive off with their car, I felt a mix of relief and nervous excitement. This was a huge risk. I knew there would be pushback, and I was prepared for the backlash. As the days went on, I had the towing company remove more and more vehicles, each one parked illegally without my permission. It wasn't just about the inconvenience anymore. It was about taking back control of my space. I made sure to document every tow and send notices to the car owners, informing them that their vehicles had been removed and giving them instructions on how to reclaim them. The first few reactions were as expected: confusion, frustration, and anger. One car owner, a longtime neighbor, even came to my warehouse, shouting at me for having their vehicle towed. They accused me of overreacting, but I calmly explained that I had given ample time for the HOA to address the issue, and nothing had changed. I reminded them that this was my private property and that the HOA had no right to treat it as a public space. As word spread throughout the neighborhood, the anger grew. Several more vehicles were towed, including one that belonged to a family member of a well-known HOA member. This seemed to escalate the tension even further. I started receiving angry phone calls, emails, and even messages from neighbors, all demanding I return their vehicles. I remained firm. I knew I wasn't in the wrong, and while I understood their frustration, I wasn't going to let them continue to take advantage of my space. One HOA member even showed up at my door, trying to guilt-trip me into letting them off the hook. The confrontation was tense, but I stood my ground. I made it clear that I wouldn't be bullied into giving up what was rightfully mine. The pressure was immense, but with each car towed, I felt more empowered. I was sending a message, not just to the people who had been abusing my warehouse, but to the entire community that I was no longer going to tolerate the disrespect. However, I knew that the next step would be the real test. The HOA was bound to retaliate, and I had to prepare for the fallout. After I took action and had several vehicles towed, the response from the HOA was swift and furious. The board members called an emergency meeting, and it didn't take long before the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. The atmosphere shifted from the usual neighborly pleasantries to one of animosity. HOA members began to mobilize, meeting behind closed doors to discuss how they could handle the situation. The first blow came when the HOA threatened me with legal action, claiming that I had violated their community guidelines. They argued that, as part of the neighborhood, I had an obligation to accommodate members' needs, even if they were using my private space without permission. The board tried to pressure me into backing down by pointing to vague rules about shared community spaces. But the more they pushed, the more confident I became in my stance. I had already consulted a lawyer, and everything I had done was within my rights. I reminded them that I had given ample notice and opportunity for them to resolve the issue themselves before I took drastic measures. The situation became even more heated when some of the neighbors who had their cars towed started showing up at my house to demand answers. A few residents took to social media, spreading accusations that I was punishing people who had simply needed a place to park. The situation quickly became a war of words, with people taking sides. On one hand, I had some neighbors who understood why I took action and offered their support. On the other, there were HOA supporters who felt I was being overly harsh. The pressure intensified as some residents organized petitions to have me removed from the neighborhood. But I wasn't backing down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how important it was to stand firm in the face of these accusations. The HOA even tried to rally more legal threats, but with the legal documentation I had gathered, I felt fully prepared to fight back. In the end, the HOA's influence began to wane. Some members of the board stepped down, realizing they had overplayed their hand. With the public backlash, many residents started seeing the issue from my perspective. What helped turn the tide was when a few longtime residents, who were tired of the HOA's overreach, came forward and publicly supported me. They acknowledged the board's failure to address the issue in the first place and praised me for standing up for my rights. Eventually, the HOA had no choice but to back off. The cars stopped showing up in my warehouse, and I regained control over my property. The community, though divided, had learned an important lesson about respecting boundaries and the rights of individuals. While I had taken a lot of heat during the process, I ultimately felt a sense of victory. Not just because I reclaimed my space, but because I had shown that you shouldn't let anyone walk over you, no matter how big or small the issue may seem. The HOA had underestimated my resolve, and that miscalculation cost them dearly. After all was said and done, the situation served as a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's yours is the only way to make things right.